At 07:42 a.m., 5th March 1944, the cold grey air above the dense pine-covered ridge of the Erprobungsstelle Rechlin test center in Mecklenburg, Germany, quivered with the roar of twin Allison V-1710 engines. Inside the cockpit of the prize aircraft, an American-built Lockheed P-38 Lightning bearing captured markings, Hauptmann Erich Walter's gloved fingers traced familiar German switches, except here they controlled an aircraft the Luftwaffe had never fielded operationally. A terse radio log crackled. WWB-123, first dive run commencing. Flap extension approved. Seconds later, the twin-engine fighter dropped into a steep dive, the nose trembling, the air whistling, as Walter gripped the stick and counted the altimeter's thousands of feet falling. He knew instinctively that the outcome of this one flight could change how the Luftwaffe viewed Allied fighters, and had him wondering whether he was testing the enemy's machine or his own faith in German engineering. As the P-38 accelerated past 0.70 Mach, something loomed at the edge of control, and below, deep in the test instrument cabin, engineers held their breath. What they were about to learn would force a rethink of tactics and shock the Luftwaffe. It is early February 1944. At the airstrip near Rechlin-Lerz, a battered P-38 that force landed intact after a navigational error is towed into the hangar. Hauptmann Erich Walter, veteran pilot of Luftwaffe Unit Erprobungskommando 25, tasked with evaluating captured Allied machines, walks down the twin-boom fuselage and runs his hand across the polished aluminium skin. The silhouette is unmistakably American. 4 50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon clustered in the nose, twin booms stretching back into distinctive tail fins. The test engineers bustle around, installing instrumentation, pitot tubes, dive angle markers, stopwatch devices wired to inertial sensors. In the briefing room, Walter listens as Oberleutnant Fischer recites the logged combat losses of P-38s in the Mediterranean theater, quoting the US manual's specification of climb to 20,000 feet in 6 minutes. Walter settles the weight of his flight suit, the faint smell of hydraulic fluid and gasoline hovering in the cold hangar. He glances at the instrument panel, unfamiliar labels, English text. The translator stands by with a clipboard. He thinks quietly, "We are flying their fighter." In the pre-flight run-up, he hears the twin Allison engines roar, feels the vibration through the rudder pedals, senses the unfamiliar yaw when the throttle is advanced. The engineers note higher manifold pressures than expected. The supercharger whine distinct from the Daimler-Benz engines he's used to. He pushes this aside and focuses. Their mission, test dive behavior, stability under high-speed conditions, exposure to Allied tactics documented in combat reports. The chapter closes with the hangar doors sliding open and the Lightning rolling out into the morning mist. The test begins. In the following days, Walter follows a pattern. Flight briefings at 09:00, taxi out at 10:15, climb to 25,000 feet, calibration runs, shallow dives to 400 nabimilliLSMF indicated. The mechanical crew note oddities. Twin-engine cooling ducts operate differently. The P-38's intercoolers incorporate turbo superchargers, unique among the Luftwaffe types. Walter sits in the cockpit. The canopy rattles with takeoff vibration. The rumble of the runway shoves through his boots. In climb, he listens to the throaty roar, watches the instruments, RPM, boost pressure, manifold temperature. He exchanges glances with the instrumentation engineer strapped in the observational rear seat, a modification for test flights. They find that the P-38 rolls slowly in the first few degrees compared to his Mi-109, but it climbs impressively. Walter notes in his log, climb rate approximately 4,000 feet per minute to 24,000 feet. 2 engines stable, roll response sluggish at low deflection angles. At lunch, the engineers compare this with captured US manuals spread across the briefing table. In the afternoon, the P-38 is briefed for a dive test from 30,000 feet to 10,000 feet. They expect the usual tail buffet familiar from earlier captured fighter evaluations. The plane arrives back with instrumentation showing a spike in elevator control force at approximately 0.6 Mach. The engineers frown, leaning over the graph paper traces. Walter watches them silently, wondering what this means for combat application. At the end of the day, he feels a weight in his chest, a suspicion that the Allied fighter may have a hidden edge, not a weakness. The chapter ends with him staring at the altimeter and Mach gauge after the dive run, tension in his jaw, the winter light fading outside. March 1st, 1944, at 32,000 feet, the air is thin, blue-grey. The P-38's twin turbo superchargers humming like twin turbines. Walther adjusts mixture and propeller pitch controls. He hears the faint groan of the structure ahead of the dive. In the hangar below, the engineers monitor data logging cards feeding continuous measurements. Walther pushes into a shallow dive. Minus 30-degree descent, speed building steadily. At around 490 mph, so he indicated, the stick begins to stiffen noticeably. The nose drops slightly without input. Buffeting begins along the tail surfaces. Walter holds firm against the control column. The aircraft shakes. The wind noise rises to a roar. The ailerons feel heavy under his grip. He pulls the dive to level flight at 12,000 feet, breathing hard. The measurements show Mach approximately 0.64, control forces increasing beyond normal parameters. The engineers exclaim among themselves, control reversal, compressibility effects. One of them flips a page from the captured US P-38 manual, discovering references to dive flaps installed outboard of engine nacelles, an emergency measure for high-speed dives. Walther debriefs in the cold briefing room. Handling altered significantly. Above 28,000 feet. Need to map correct control regime for operational use. He glances at the data sheets. Across a range of dives, the P-38 appears less susceptible to catastrophic compressibility than previously reported by Allied pilots, but still troubling. The sense of unease grows among the test team. They're chasing knowledge, but it may be knowledge about an aircraft that has been hiding a tactical surprise all along. The chapter closes with Walter absorbing the cold flight deck silence, the low hum of instruments cooling, and the steady thought, we may be witnessing something unforeseen. 7 March 1944. Walther braces for a high-angle dive test. The P-38 is configured with full instrumentation, pitot boom extended, telemetry antennas trailing, camera recording tails of dive runs for post-flight analysis. The objective? Dive from 35,000 feet, release dive flaps at 0.75, Mach equivalent indicated, level out at 10,000 feet, assess control reversal margin under extreme conditions. Walther starts the run. Descent begins, altimeter dropping rapidly, speed building faster than previous tests. At Mach approximately 0.70, the nose begins to drop unexpectedly. Ailerons respond sluggishly to correction inputs. Elevator authority reduces dangerously. Walter fights the stick with both hands, senses a tail shake vibrating under his boots. The twin booms flex slightly, visible in his peripheral vision. His heart hits his ribs hard. He obtains level attitude only with full rudder deflection and aileron trim adjustments. The data card later shows control input force 1.8 times normal, tail buffet frequency measured at 8 to 9 Hz, one engine overheats during the recovery pull. At landing, smoke trails from the right engine nacelle, visible to ground crew. The mechanics find the intercooler duct delaminated from thermal stress. Walther writes in the official log, "Aircraft must be limited in dive profile until design flaw understood. Recommend caution for operational pilots." The mood in the hangar darkens. The American design may outperform in certain flight regimes, but at a structural cost. Walther leans against the fuselage, hearing the echo of turbo superchargers winding down, thinking, what else does it do that we don't know? He closes the chapter with the realization that their test program will need adaptation. Wartime urgency now intersects directly with engineering risk and pilot safety. Walther returns to flying the P-38 daily through mid-March. He notices that the tail-shaken buffet onset happen at slightly different dive angles depending on altitude, and that if he maintains a shallower dive, -15 degrees instead of -30, from 28,000 feet, the control forces remain manageable and speed builds to nearly 500 Newton-weight without extreme buffeting. He reports the observation to the engineers during the evening debrief. Among the test crew, one older engineer, Feldwebel Klink, recalls hearing of a captured intelligence report that an American pilot discovered reducing one engine power in dive restored control authority. The engineers brushed this off initially, but Walther files a separate note in his flight log. At dawn on 12th of March, he climbs to 30,000 feet, power set to maximum continuous, dives at -20 degrees. At approximately 0.66 Mach, he reduces the right engine throttle to idle, feathers the propeller, noise decreases sharply, yaw is minimal, the aircraft stabilizes noticeably. Speed climbs to approximately 515 mph indicated, equivalent to roughly 0.75 Mach in that altitude and temperature regime. He pulls a level at 10,000 feet, revives the engine smoothly, everything nominal. In the hangar, engineers inspect the telemetry data. Control authority improved by 23% compared to previous runs. Walther's voiceover entry in his log reads, "Engine shutdown in dive, stabilizes roll coupling and delays onset of control reversal." The engineers share glances across the workbench. This is a significant risk to propose operationally, but they now believe the P-38 has a hidden dive advantage if one engine is carefully managed. This alternative dive tactic could upend Luftwaffe interception doctrine against high-altitude escort fighters. The chapter ends with Walther looking at the jet-black sky outside the hangar windows and thinking, we're on the verge of something different. News of Walther's findings reaches the high command of the Erprobungsstelle by mid-March. Major Dr. Hoffmann convenes a technical meeting. Does the P-38's twin-engine dive procedure require a revision of Luftwaffe interception tactics against Allied bomber formations? Walther stands at attention, pointing to graphs showing speed versus dive angle versus control force measurements. He explains the engine shutdown technique in dive improves both control authority and terminal speed. The Major frowns, considering operational implications. Walther adds carefully, "If we can exploit this characteristic, we may adopt dive attack tactics formerly reserved for our Me-109s and FW-190s, but using knowledge of enemy equipment characteristics." Meanwhile, the mechanical crew report that running one engine at idle during a sustained dive places unusual stress on turbochargers and increases risk of fire or catastrophic failure. Engine maintenance logs show higher exhaust gas temperatures and unbalanced thrust loads. The engineers warn formally, "We have to set stricter maintenance intervals and pre-flight inspections." Walther nods, aware of the operational risk this implies. On the next flight, he attempts the technique under close supervision from ground observers. The aircraft screams downward in the thin air. Walther shuts the right engine smoothly. The nose drops initially. Speed builds rapidly. He feels the aircraft stabilize under his hands. He pulls level firmly. Radio log from the observation seat records. Good result. Control forces normalizing at 0.70 Mach end run. On landing, Walther climbs out slowly. The late afternoon sun slanting across the concrete hangar floor. He removes his leather helmet, wipes sweat from his brow. This might change how the Luftwaffe fights, and how the Allies must think about their own equipment. The chapter ends with his quiet reflection. We have the data, now comes the decision whether to implement it operationally. Mid-March 1944, Allied bomber streams over Germany are growing heavier daily. The US 8th Air Force now fields large formations escorted by P-38s, P-47s, and the newer P-51 Mustangs. The Luftwaffe is under intense pressure to intercept effectively with diminishing fighter strength. The test center at Rechlin is tasked with accelerating evaluation so frontline units receive updated tactical guidance immediately. Walther's P-38 is prepared for a full operational profile dive. 37,000 feet departure, one engine in-dive configuration, level pull at 12,000 feet, brief climb back to altitude for data collection. He briefs a small group of Luftwaffe pilots who will practice the technique on their own single-engine fighters where applicable. The rumble of the P-38's turbochargers echoes loudly in the hangar as the twin-boom craft taxis and takes off into clear morning air. Walther climbs steadily, reaches 36,500 feet, runs the pre-dive checks, initiates dive at calculated angle. Shutting the right engine, he feels the yaw moment. He counteracts with rudder. Speed builds rapidly to gauge approximately 520 mph. Aircraft remains steady throughout. He levels off smoothly, climbs back to altitude. The pilots on the ground whisper among themselves. It works consistently. But then the right engine shows signs of overheating during post-flight inspection. The mechanics note a worn turbocharger, bearing requiring immediate replacement. Walther lands, slows to a stop on the taxiway. He steps out and removes his flight gloves, seeing small oil leak at the nacelle joint. The technicians look concerned. The risk of implementing this technique in combat operations seems increasingly real. Walther's inner voice. This is no longer experimental. It will become operational doctrine if we survive the engineering challenges long enough. The chapter ends with him scribbling in his notebook. Prepare tactical directive for frontline units, subject to engine risk mitigation protocols and maintenance requirements. At the end of March 1944, the test center compiles its findings into a formal operational directive. Luftwaffe Spezialrichtlinie Nr. 11-44. Dive attack procedure for captured twin-boom aircraft profiles, based in large part on Walther's engine shutdown dive method and supporting data. In a sparse conference room, the directive is read aloud to assembled officers. Intercept teams will use climb and dive profiles, shallow angle entry between -15 and -20 degrees, one engine in-dive configuration, where applicable, target speed approximately 0.75 Mach if structural limits allow. The directive also warns explicitly of engine stress and limitations of twin-engine layout in high-angle recovery maneuvers. Walther watches from the side of the room. Beyond him, Luftwaffe operational planners debate intensely whether to train fighter units on this method immediately or retrofit their own twin-engine heavy fighters with similar capabilities. The human cost is tangible and discussed. Mechanics struggle with higher maintenance workloads. Pilots must practice the new dive profile under supervision. Walther sits by the hangar at dusk, the P-38's distinctive silhouette stark against fading light. He remembers the first flight weeks ago, the tail shake that alarmed him, the moment of clarity when one engine off restored control. he felt a fundamental change in the machine's behavior. He glances at the instrument panel overlay they installed for continuous monitoring. The quiet hum of the hangar is broken by the distant rumble of a departing FW-190 on routine patrol. The directive circulates through command channels that night. In his quarters, Walther reads the final typed copy, noting his name in the acknowledgements section. He closes the folder and stares at the ceiling, thinking of bomber crews overhead, of interceptor pilots preparing for morning sorties. The chapter closes with a simple truth. The tactic is ready, but will it be disseminated and used in time to matter? For April 1944, over the skies of central Germany, radar stations have picked up a formation of 800 heavy bombers, escorted by P-38s and P-51s, pushing deep into German airspace. Jagdgeschwader 77 scrambles from their forward base. Among them is Lieutenant Karl Bruckmann, flying an Mi-109 G6, a seasoned pilot with 15 confirmed kills. Unknown to him until this morning, the new dive procedure had been forwarded to his staffel overnight. As his unit climbs steadily to 33,000 feet in clear cold air, they sight the American bomber stream glinting in the morning sun like a slow river of metal. Bruckmann leads the attack element. He dives from 30,000 feet at -20 degrees, throttle backed slightly, his mind racing through the briefing points. He remembers the instruction, maintain shallow dive angle, to build speed without structural risk. He glances at his engine panel. He does not have twin engine to cut like the captured P-38, but he keeps the shallow dive angle and builds speed rapidly, aided by altitude advantage. Meanwhile, the captured P-38 in the hangar at Rechlin sits idle, its test flights complete, its accumulated knowledge now transmitted. Back at Rechlin, Walther monitors via radionet from the operations room. He hears tally-ho as B-17 formations flare white in the sun. On the front line, Bruckmann slams into the bomber stream from above, uses high-speed hit-and-run exactly as briefed, then climbs away steeply. He keeps dive and climb angles shallow, a direct signature of Walter's tested method. One P-38 escort attempts to intercept him, but coordinated. Brackets of Mi-109s and FW-190s, designed to mimic the procedure, overwhelm the escort spacing. Bruckmann fires a long burst. One bomber bursts into flame and falls away. The escort fighter spins away, trailing smoke. On the ground at Rechlin, the radio crackles with field reports. Bruckmann, one bomber destroyed. Escort formation disrupted. Walter allows himself a quiet smile in the operations room, but the next message cuts through. Engine temperature exceeded operational limits. Oil pressure dropping. The cost is immediate and sobering. Back at the airfield, Bruckmann lands with engine temps in the red zone. Mechanics swarm the aircraft. The test center receives the after-action report by evening. Tactic effective, but engine stress confirmed under operational conditions. Walter reads the report silently, his jaw tight. The chapter had opened with hope. It closes with the realization that the concept works under fire, but the cost may prove too steep for widespread adoption. Meanwhile, back at Rechlin, machinery hums and data flows through the test center, yet the P-38 test aircraft sits patched but sidelined. The right engine's turbo bearing failed during the final March trial. Replacement parts are scarce. The mechanics struggle with improvised solutions. Walther returns to the cockpit to verify alternate dive profiles. No complete engine shutdown, but a single engine power reduction technique tested for safety margin and reliability. He starts the engines, lets them warm to operating temperature, checks boost pressure carefully, climbs to 29,000 feet, sets up dive entry at shallow angle, reduces right engine to idle power. Speed builds controllably, control forces remain manageable throughout. But as he pulls level at 15,000 feet, the right engine coughs irregularly, flames flick briefly at the nacelle edge. He lands fast, shuts down immediately. The mechanics examine the turbocharger closely. Shaft failure, clear signs of overheating and metal fatigue. They report grimly. Service life exceeded. Component replacement required. Walter rubs his temple, exhaustion setting in. He realizes the engine shutdown dive technique cannot be readily exported to present frontline aircraft without significant reliability issues. It must be restricted to controlled testing environments. He drafts a caution amendment to the directive. Dive procedure must include mandatory pre-flight turbo bearing inspection, maximum time in idle engine dive configuration limited to 60 seconds continuous. The human cost weighs heavily now. An engineer contracted pneumonia working in the cold flight deck during winter tests. A pilot aborted his evaluation run when a gearbox whined ominously. The room is heavy with tension during the evening debrief. Walter stands by the fuselage at sunset, the hangar lights humming overhead, casting long shadows. He knows with certainty the breakthrough may yet be lost to logistical constraint and material limitations. The chapter closes with his inward thought: innovation is worthless if you cannot sustain it operationally. 10th April 1944. Walter takes the P-38 out for one final acceptance run before recommending the aircraft be retired from active testing. He climbs to 35,000 feet in crisp dawn air, the sky pale blue above. Onboard sensors indicate climb rate holding steady, manifold pressure at maximum allowable. Performance graph climbing steeply on the recording paper. He flares over the airfield in a climbing turn, then pushes into dive from 34,000 feet at minus 18 degrees, cuts right engine throttle to idle smoothly, maintaining left engine at full power. The aircraft drops cleanly, the turbocharger spool changes tone noticeably, the nose stabilizes without hunting. The buffeting that plagued earlier test runs is completely gone. Indicated airspeed climbs past 530 mph, estimated true airspeed near 580 mph at altitude. Walter fights the increasing G-load as he pulls level. His vision tunnels slightly. The slender cockpit frame presses at his shoulders. He pulls level at 12,000 feet. The twin booms reflect the spring sunrise in polished metal. Data recording engineers monitoring from the rear seat cheer quietly. Control forces down 30%, roll rate improved significantly, elevator authority maintained throughout the envelope. Late April 1944. At a frontline Luftwaffe base in northern Germany, Staffelkapitän Friedrich Becker reviews training film footage. Me-109s and FW-190s executing shallow dive attack profiles, shutter cameras catching frozen moments of Allied formations under attack. The message of the P-38 evaluation has been formally disseminated through command channels. Becker's unit adapts their standing tactics. Climb to 30,000 feet or above, shallow dive at prescribed angles, strike bomber formation with speed advantage, then climb away immediately. Early intercept reports show modest improvement in engagement success rates, but Allied escorts are learning and catching more fighters during the climb-away phase. In the field, pilot Hans Schneider writes to his wife in careful script, "We now use the shallow dive method developed at the test center. Speed builds faster than before. The bomber escort does not expect the angle of attack. The letter passes through military sensors. Meanwhile, at the test center in Rechlin, the P-38 test aircraft is officially retired from flight status. The damaged engine is eventually cannibalized for spare parts to support other captured aircraft evaluations." The airframe is carefully parked under canvas tarpaulins in the storage area. Walther inspects it one last time before his departure orders to another posting arrive. He places his palm flat on the cold twin-boom tail section and says quietly, "Thank you for the knowledge." An archive file note dated 14th of April 1944 reads simply, "Captured type evaluation completed 12 April 1944. P-38 Lightning. Aircraft retired from test status." The human truth. Underneath the bureaucratic language, lives gambled on experimental procedures, machines teetering at structural limits, innovation born under the pressure of total war. Walther walks away slowly as mechanics wheel the P-38 into long-term storage. The chapter ends with him staring out over the airfield as a heavy formation, thunder rolls overhead in the distance, thinking of how one captured aircraft changed tactical doctrine. In the hush of May 1944, Walther sits in his quarters, his flight boots placed carefully by the door, the hum of distant air raid sirens drifting through the evening. He opens the final test report cover. Böttgen, Einsatzanalyse, Typ P-38, Erprobungsergebnisse und Ableitung für Einsatzflugzeuge. He reads the typed conclusion slowly. While the P-38's twin-engine layout presents significant logistic and structural limitations, the shallow dive, one-engine reduced power technique widens potential interceptor envelope against high-altitude escort fighters when properly executed. He closes the report carefully and looks at the photograph pinned above his desk. The P-38 in Luftwaffe markings on the tarmac. Outside the window, the winds over Mecklenburg carry the roar of the morning's first takeoffs. He thinks of the Allied airmen who flew the P-38 in the Pacific Theatre and over Europe, how their machines served with distinction in countless engagements. He respects their skill and their courage. He also knows that capturing their aircraft and flying it in reverse evaluation trained the attacker in ways combat alone could not. The swirl of the air war is subtly changed by such knowledge. In a quiet internal voice, one aircraft, one engineer's calculated gamble, one pilot's experimental dive, and the course of aerial interception doctrine shifted incrementally. The test center at Rechlin closed its doors in 1945 as the war ended and the P-38 airframe was eventually scrapped for metal. Yet the technical documentation remains preserved in military archives. Walther stands from his desk, opens the window, feels the damp spring air on his face and whispers into the wind. In war, the machine that surprises often wins the engagement. The camera might linger on the empty hangar bay where the P-38 once stood, a silent monument to wartime innovation. In the end, the enduring truth: innovation is fragile, risk is ever present, and the human heart beats steady in the cockpit of every aircraft that flies.